All right, last week. I'm trying to get everybody to quiet down. Terry. Last week we talked a little about what Jesus said about Bethsaida, Capernaum, and Chorazin. While describing their situation, Jesus uses a word several times. Anybody remember what the word is? Woe. All right? He says, woe unto you, Chorazin. Woe unto you, Bethsaida, etc., etc., etc. And then he compares them to what would have happened in Tyre and Sidon if the mighty works had been done in them that were done in the cities at Jesus' time. I want to talk just briefly about this word woe. The definition of the word in Greek includes these particular ideas: affliction and grief and ruinous trouble, calamity, etc., etc., etc. But woe is actually a little bit more than that. It's actually what's called an onomatopoeia. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. It is the formation of a word from the sound which it is associated with its name. So, boing, okay, or clap, or zap, or sizzle. These are all ideas of the same word, same idea, where words are spelt to try to make the sound like it is when you say it. If you remember, some of you will, I'm sure, the TV program Hee Haw, right? There was a song on there that said, "The gloom, despair, and agony on me, deep, dark depression, excessive misery." What were they defining? And then what did they say after each verse? And if you listen very carefully, they didn't actually say the word woe as we do. It was more of a, oh, okay? They were doing the definition and then pronouncing the word in its what the form would be if you were really in agony. All right?
Do you think the ancient Greeks, when they...
I'm getting into that.
All right. I was just wondering if it came...
I don't know that for sure, but I am going to deal with that here right now. After each of the verses, they would say that word, but they would say it in such a way, I went back and listened to one of the old things. They don't actually say the word. It's a cry of anguish and grief that sounds like the word woe in a way. It conveyed the sense of true hopelessness and despair. These kinds of woe statements are often found in the Old Testament. Examples are Isaiah chapter 5 and Habakkuk chapter 3, where the prophets declare a series of woe statements pronouncing various judgments. In Isaiah chapter 6, verse 5, the prophet sees the throne of God and declares a woe because he realizes just how holy God is and how wretched Isaiah himself is not in comparison. The prophet, therefore, expects to be destroyed as a result. It is more of a cry of anguish rather than a simple pronunciation of some word that is spoken. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus speaks 7 such woes. And this is towards the end of his life, just before he's going to, not long before he's going to die on the cross. And he does this to the Jewish nation in general and to the Pharisees specifically. How Jesus would have spoken these words is not just in anger, but in exclamation of true grief and anguish because of what he knew was about to happen to the people that were descendants of Abraham. At the end of this agonizing expose, this is what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 23, starting in 37. "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather my children together as a hen would gather her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Or as the King James says, you would not. You wouldn't do it. This wasn't spoken with a pointed finger. This was spoken with anguish. Why? Because God had tried to get people to do his will ever since the time of Adam and Eve. And it fell apart during the time of Noah, and it fell apart during the time of Sodom, and it fell apart during the time of the tower, and it fell apart until God chose a particular people that surely these people will remember me, and they will spread the word, and they will bring the saving grace of the Messiah eventually. And those people themselves fell in the same trap as all the other nations. And Jesus was in anguish over it when he made those statements. Often we think of the Jewish nation as God's chosen people that backslid from time to time. But that wasn't necessarily the case. Jesus knew their hearts and what was coming, and it grieved him. God had given them every chance and every opportunity he could for them to repent. God had been faithful to them even when they were unfaithful. Faithful to them even when even when they were unfaithful to him. He had punished all those other evil nations in the Old Testament and pronounced judgments on them because of how they had from time to time been treating his own people. So he had protected them. And still, we find at this point, they didn't. Jesus makes predictions of what's going to happen to that city, and specifically to that temple in Matthew chapter 24 and 25, Luke chapter 21, and Mark chapter 13. Now, I have a series of lessons that I have taught before that is weeks long. It's not going to be my purpose to do that. In fact, Terry did this here not too long ago, so my purpose is not going to be going into detailed discussion of these passages. Our purpose today is only to give a glimpse of what Jesus foretold and compare it to what history said actually happened. So in other words, we're going to treat Jerusalem just like we did Babylon, just like we did Assyria, just like we did Tyre and all the other nations we've been doing for weeks. Jesus has just stated those 7 woes on the Jewish nation, and then, upon leaving the temple area, the disciples draw his attention to the temple itself, the huge stones and the magnificence of the building. This building was truly grand. It had taken around 40 years to construct, and many of its huge stones were covered with gold. But Jesus does not give the response that the disciples expected. In Luke chapter 21, verse 6, he says, "The time will come when not one of these stones will be left on top of another. Every one of them will be thrown down." I think this would have perked their interest. So, what do they do next? They ask some questions. We're going to deal with 2 of the questions today and in a very specific way. And we're not going to get off topic on this, okay? Because there's probably a ton of questions people have about this, but this isn't the class for that. They wanted to know, number 1, when will these things happen? And secondly, what will be a sign? So, they want to know the what, and they want to know the when. And I'm going to simply summarize some of Jesus' answers. So, these are the kinds of things that they ask as far as the when. Or this is Jesus' answers to some of the whens. "Many shall come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and lead many astray. Wars and rumors of wars, and nation will rise up against nation. Earthquakes and famine. You will be delivered up to councils, governors. He's talking specifically to the 12 right here. Kings, synagogues, and you will be beaten. And there will be false prophets that will come. These are the things that Jesus is saying will happen before what he's predicting. All right? And this is an example of the whats that Jesus deals with in those chapters. Jerusalem will be surrounded by armies. If that happens, the time is close. Pray that you are not pregnant. Pray that it is not winter, because there will be a great tribulation. The tribulation, this idea of suffering, etc., will be worse than any seen from the beginning of creation until the time when Jesus is speaking. And it will be so bad that God will shorten or limit what is going to happen for the sake of the elect. The elect. And the elect, of course, is talking about the Christian. God's wrath will be on this people, in other words, the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, and they shall fall by the sword and be led captive into the nations. And finally, Jerusalem will be trodden down by the Gentiles. This is quite a laundry list if you think about it. Too often, over the centuries, people have tried to take the predictions made in the Bible and force them to point to modern and current events or people. And these passages that we're discussing are among the most abused in this, all right? But Jesus is answering the questions asked by the disciples, and he clearly states that these things will happen within their lifetimes, not in 2023. Therefore, sometime between when Jesus lived and when all the disciples died, this would probably take place. And such a time came in 70 AD. So let's talk a little bit about the when, things that Jesus said. Before the destruction of Jerusalem, the things that Jesus said would happen actually happened. For instance, the Jewish historian Josephus, and we'll talk a little more about him in a minute, said this. Theudas persuaded a great part of the people to follow him, for he told them he was a prophet and that he would, by his own command, divide the river and afford them an easy passage over it, and many were deluded by his words. This is one example of many that Josephus gives of what Jesus said about these predictions. Now, what I want you to know, and I'll mention this, I think I've got it written in here later, Josephus was not a Christian, all right? He was not trying to do anything that Jesus said and try to make it come true. He was not a Christian. In fact, for part of the time in the Jewish war against Jerusalem, he wasn't even a Jew, okay? He went over to the side of the Romans. He was a historian. We're going to talk a little more about him in a second. He also stated this: there was also another body of wicked men gotten together. These were such men as deceived and deluded the people under pretense of divine inspiration. And these prevailed the multitudes to act like madmen and went before them in the wilderness to pretend that God would show them signals of liberty. Josephus wrote a book about this thick. It's at least as big as the Bible. It's a very large book, very small print. He has lots and lots of parts into it. One of the parts has to do with antiquities, which is things that happened way before he was ever born, and he writes it down as historical reference. But the part that we're talking about is about 200 pages long in fine print, like I just said. And those 200 pages in fine print talk about what's called the Wars of the Jews. And a lot of it at the beginning has to do with the things during his lifetime and just before that led up to the destruction of Jerusalem, which actually is covered in 80 pages, 80 of those 200. So when he's writing these two statements that we just read, they are in preparation for, they are before the actual destruction of Jerusalem. There were so many other of these impostors that Josephus also wrote despairingly of these false prophets, saying, "Now, as for the affairs of the Jews, they grew worse and worse continually, for the country was again filled with robbers and impostors who deluded the multitudes. Yet did Felix catch and put to death many of those impostors every day." There was a ton of them, just like Jesus had predicted. Josephus is writing after Jesus. Okay? We'll get into that in a second, too. Jesus had died and promised to return. So what likely happened? There's a lot of these guys were claiming that they were him because they wanted their claim to fame. We got people doing that still today, but not as much as back then. The prediction of the persecution of the disciples, this is one of the other ones. We're into another one now for a moment. Jesus predicted that the disciples would have major catastrophes happening to them. This one should be a no-brainer for any Bible student. For instance, Herod killed James and then proceeded to capture Peter. The Jewish leaders brought Paul before the Sanhedrin, they put a lot of the apostles in prison over and over and over again. Then it was Paul that stood before governors Felix and Festus, and then King Agrippa, and then finally he was ultimately taken to Caesar. Josephus writes this about the same thing, about the same kind of thing. He's not going down the Bible and reading and go, hey, this happened. He's just writing about what happened. And it happens to line up with what Jesus says. Josephus says, he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, those whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. Josephus is basically saying, this is what happened after this man Jesus died. He's historically recording what happened, just like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and Acts are. Church historian Eusebius makes this statement. It is therefore recorded that Paul was beheaded in Rome and that Peter was crucified by Nero. And eventually, if we read enough history, we find that all the apostles that Jesus was speaking to that day were martyred. Some historians give accounts of the numerous upticks in wars and earthquakes and famines that happened during the period between 30 AD and 70 AD. I couldn't necessarily take the time to go through and find all those and write them. We just don't have time in one class to do this. But one by one, all of the things that Jesus said would happen before an onslaught of the city and the total destruction of the temple actually happened, just like Jesus predicted. Much of what we know about what took place during this destruction of Jerusalem does come from this man, Flavius Josephus. He was born about 8 years after Jesus died, and he wrote extensively, like I said before, about Jewish history, both ancient and contemporary. And the part that is called the Wars of the Jews have to do with the time period preceding and then eventually the destruction of Jerusalem itself, which takes up about 80 pages altogether. We're only going to do a smattering of what he says about that. But this is a statement that he makes that's really interesting, and it's rather an important one. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, Those who loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. This was 40 years after Jesus, at least 40 years after Jesus had died and resurrected. This man was not a Christian. But this tells what other people knew about Jesus at the time, and how Josephus, probably still being prejudiced towards the Jewish religion, wrote a compliment about this man. Okay? Some people say, well, Josephus doesn't know what he's talking about. Okay? I think he does, because he actually matches up with what is said in the scriptures. Josephus was actually there while Jerusalem was surrounded and then destroyed. Sometime during the siege, he actually had gone over to the Roman side. And so he was able to give firsthand account of what happened both inside and outside the walls of that city. The first indication of what comes next. Matthew's account uses Jewish symbolism taken from Daniel and then speaks of the abomination of desolation. But it's Luke that actually gives a clear vision of what's going on, so that somebody like a Gentile like us can know exactly what Jesus is referring to. Luke says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those that are in Judea flee to the mountains. He doesn't say just Jerusalem, and that's important here in a second. What actually happened is documented by the things which Josephus writes. Jerusalem was intentionally surrounded by the Roman general Gaius Cestius Gallus. And he writes, Josephus writes, Cestius, observing that the disturbances that were begun among the Jews afforded him a proper opportunity to attack them, took his whole army along with him, and put the Jews into flight and pursued them to Jerusalem. So in other words, he kind of drove them into that area, and they all went into the city. And we'll find out why here in just a second. The Roman armies surrounded Jerusalem as Jesus predicted, and if the followers of Jesus were paying attention, then they would know it was time to leave. But now the city is surrounded. How can they do that? Well, you can almost hear Josephus disgust when he writes the following. It then happened that Cestius, which is the Roman general that originally surrounded the city, was not conscious either how the besieged despaired of success or how courageous the people were for him. And so he recalled his soldiers from the place, and by despairing of any expectation of taking it without having received any disgrace, he retired from the city without a reason in the world. Here's what happened, okay? And there's lots of theories. I'm not going to go into that part of it, but the Jerusalem city was surrounded. For whatever reason, Josephus at the time when he was writing this does not know the reason. The whole Roman army that was there left for a period. Now, some say it's because he was recalled, and then when he came back, Titus came with him. I don't remember the history of that, and I don't think anybody totally agrees. But the point isn't exactly what happened. The point is the army was there, and then all of a sudden the army was gone. Ding! Here's your sign. Okay? Christians at that point were supposed to know what to do. When the Christians inside the city saw this, they knew they needed to leave and that they only had a small window of opportunity to do so. Eusebius writes that the people of the church in Jerusalem, people of the church in Jerusalem were commanded by revelation to leave, and that the time of the attack had actually come. He goes on to say the whole land of Judea was entirely destitute. The whole land of Judea, not just Jerusalem. I never noticed that till this time through. They didn't just leave the city. They got out of Judea. They just left the whole area. Destitute of holy men. He's talking about Christians. They all left. The judgment of God at length overtook those who committed such outrageous acts against Christ. Who are we talking about? We're talking about the rest of the Jews that would not convert. And totally destroyed that generation's impious men. Again, talking of the Jews at the time. Luke says this in chapter 21. The days of vengeance, there would be days of vengeance and great distress in the land and wrath upon the people. I guess I had them both up there. Matthew says, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until the time no, nor ever shall be. The word tribulation has been used as a hot button word for those that are trying to pin it on current events that supposedly point to the second coming of Christ within our lifetime. And that's not what it is there for. It is not what Matthew means. Like Luke states, what Jesus says simply means an affliction, an anguish, and a persecution, a suffering. Just like what might happen as a result of the woes spoken by Jesus just previous to the statements that he's making now. Jesus knew that really bad things were going to happen to this city, and it grieved him greatly. And one of the things was what is being talked about in those two passages right there. Some have questioned how Jerusalem could ever suffer more destruction and death and horror than any other event in human history up to that time. But there are factors that we're going to explain that Josephus brings up that makes this clear. And while it is possible that Jesus is using hyperbole, a closer look at the devastation brought upon Jerusalem in 70 AD reveals a period of pain, terror, and plunder that can be arguably able to surpass any other. The demise began about the time of the Passover in 70 AD. Tacitus, another historian, says that there were at least 600,000 visitors in Jerusalem when it was surrounded. Visitors. That's not including the people that were actually there, because everybody from all over came to the Passover every year, so that there were lots and lots and lots of other people in the city, all crowded inside the city walls. The total siege lasted 6 or 7 months. Not only did the siege begin to choke the food supply, but the problem was compounded by warring factions within the city. So they started warring against each other. Josephus says that there were 3 armies of zealots. Now, if you remember what a zealot is, they are people that are zealous for the law of Moses. They were the guys that would go around and killing Roman soldiers at random if they could get away with it. Simon was a zealot who converted eventually because Jesus brought him out. But zealots were Jewish nationalists that were nasty. And there's 3 major groups, at least inside the city right now, that are warring against each other while the Roman armies are outside trying to break in. One of their strategies of these 3 different zealot groups was to burn the other's food supply so that they would have food and the other ones wouldn't. Well, what resulted was that all of the corn supply that was in the city was all burnt, enough to last for many years if there was a siege. So what happens all of a sudden is, and this happened quick, there was no food in that city. that could be eaten. Therefore, famine quickly took hold, and the famine was so bad that the details will turn anybody's stomach. We're only going to talk about a few. If you want to read the rest of them, there's 80 pages in Josephus you can read. The militant factions inside the city raided the streets, killing many and confiscating all of the food. Josephus says this. Plug your ears and close your eyes if you don't want to listen. They also invented terrible methods of torment to discover where the food was, and they were these: to stop up the passages of privy parts of the miserable wretches, and to drive sharp stakes into their fundamentals. And you can use your imagination to figure out what they were doing. As the famine worsened, he says that the upper rooms were full of women and children that were dying of famine, and the lanes of the city were full of dead bodies of the aged. At one point, and I forgot where I read this, I couldn't find it again, but it says that the streets in some places were so full of dead bodies, you had to walk on the dead bodies or you couldn't get through. One report, and the children and the men all swelled with famine and fell down dead wheresoever their misery seized them. One report before the entire ordeal was finished said that a number of the dead from the famine was more than 600,000. More than 600,000 people died simply of starvation. And many dead bodies, they claim, also were never actually able to be counted. When Jews attempted to desert the city, they tried to leave and go over to the Roman side. It says that out of the wrath and hatred they bore, talking about the Roman soldiers, that they bore for the Jews, they nailed them. They nailed those they caught one after another, and another after another, and to crosses. They put them on crosses by way of jest. Certain Jews coming out of the city all swallowed their gold. In other words, they were going to try to leave, surrender the Romans. They swallowed some of their gold, and then they were hoping to get it out later. All right? But unfortunately, the Roman people figured this out, and the soldiers, when they heard this, they cut out those that came as supplicants and searched their bellies. So they didn't even know for sure who had gold and who didn't. They just started cutting them up to see who had it and who didn't. Other reports tell of mothers eating their babies and other forms of cannibalism. I'll stop the atrocities there. There's 80 pages of this, guys. As the disciples sat marveling at the buildings of the temple, they could not resist drawing Jesus' attention to the architecture and the magnificence of the structures. Surely they believed that the city was going to stand for a very, very long time throughout history. Imagine their surprise when Jesus declared and prophesied that, do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Josephus notes that the Roman soldiers put fire to the gates. Then the silver that was over them quickly carried the flames to the wood that was within. So the silver started melting first and got hot, and that started the gates on fire. Whence it spread itself all of a sudden and caught hold of the cloisters, in other words, the covered porches. So everything started burning. And as for what was left in the temple, he notes that the Roman soldiers, that a Roman soldier was being lifted up by another soldier, set fire to the golden window through which there was a passage to the rooms that were about the holy house on the north side. Josephus also tells how Titus tried to stop his soldiers from destroying the remainder of the temple. He didn't want them actually to do that, but he was unsuccessful in stopping them. Josephus goes on to say that the flames burst out from within the holy house, talking about the temple, immediately, and thus the house was burnt down. Now, that doesn't account for everything that Jesus says, though. Originally, the disciples proudly pointed out the huge stones that made up the temple. It was then that Jesus told them not one stone would be left on top of another. Accounts of the destruction say that as the flames engulfed the temple, gold and silver and other precious metals stored inside the temple, as well as those that were affixed to the outside, because there was a lot of gold and silver on the walls itself. All of that started melting and coming down and dripping between the cracks. So the Roman soldiers pried the stones apart until they were all on the ground, and that way they were able to recover all of that gold and all of that silver and all of those precious everything, all the kinds of anything that was of any worth. And in the end, there was no stone that was left on top of the other because of what they had to do to get the gold out. Jesus also said that many of these people, talking about the Hebrew people themselves, would fall by the sword and be led captive into the nations. A final estimated number of those that were killed in the siege that lasted from March until September was about a little over 1 million. Some say about 1.1 million. Plus, there were another 97,000 Jewish people that were taken prisoner and sold to the Gentiles, just as Jesus had stated. Not only were great numbers killed, but also many were led captive. So significant was he, so affected was he that Josephus says the following: accordingly, the multitude of those that therein perished exceeded all the destructions that either men or God ever brought upon the world. Is he agreeing with Jesus? Absolutely. And he should know, because he has the book is 700 pages long, so I would estimate he has 400 or 500 pages on the history of what happened to the Jews previously. He was well versed on wars and calamities that had happened in previous generations, going all the way back to, I don't know how long ways back. The gold and silver and the Jewish captives were then taken back to Rome. In the years that followed, the Roman Colosseum was built. Everybody remembers that. Something I'd kind of like to see someday, never have. The same Colosseum that would eventually be used to persecute Christians. It was the gold and the silver taken from the temple at Jerusalem that was used to finance this, one of the seventh wonders of the world. It was the Jewish gold that was used to finance the building of the Colosseum. And some say, and I'm pretty sure this is true, some say that it was many of those Hebrews that were captured in Jerusalem's destruction that became the labor force to build this. Josephus has more to say about the destruction of Jerusalem. Like I said, a very large book, very tiny print. So much so that it is impossible to ignore how much this looks like a fulfillment of the prophecy made by Jesus. This is yet another reason why skeptics attempt to date the Gospels later than they were actually written. And remember, we discussed that in detail towards the beginning of this class, especially during the time when we listened to a guy named Peter Williams that made the comparison between the Gnostic Gospels and the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and Acts, and how They try to make Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and Acts written, say, 100 to 200 AD, or even a little bit later, because that's when the Gnostic Gospels were. But he showed reasons why that can't be true. If the destruction of Jerusalem happened in 70, and they can get you to believe that the Gospels were not written until 100 or 200, what does that do?
No credibility.
All of a sudden, it's not prophecy anymore, it's history. Do you see why they do this? They do this to destroy the Bible. Those dates are important, and Christians go, well, it doesn't really matter, I just believe it. Well, it kind of does really matter, okay? The same idea as what we see in something like Isaiah and a lot of the Old Testament prophets, but specifically they've tried to do this with Isaiah, where they've tried to make it and say, well, Isaiah was written after the time of Jesus. Therefore, it's history. It's not predicting Jesus. No, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. It had almost every book of the Bible in it, except I think maybe one. Several copies, complete copies of Isaiah. And they were copies that were written as early as 200 BC. Okay? Poof, there goes that. But they never stop. Okay? They never stop. The same thing is true, like I just said, with the Old Testament. Even the books of Moses, they try to make Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy as being written way later, like up to 1,000 years, 800 to 1,000 years after when Moses actually wrote it. And we've done classes on that here too, on the topic of the documentary hypothesis and how wrong that is. But Bible prophecy, I think, is an amazing study. Too often it's been shoved under the rug, because then we start having supposedly the problem with the people that take the Bible prophecy and shove it in and make it do things that it's not supposed to do. But if kept in its proper perspective, it's actually a fascinating study. But too often it is misused to show things that were never intended. When the Bible foretells what is going to happen to specific people and nations, there is a fixed set of purposes. This is what it is not supposed to do. The Old Testament prophecies never are predictive of specific events that are happening in our present culture. But here are some reasons for Bible prophecy. To warn of impending doom and of a specific nation that is being talked to by a prophet through God, or by God through a prophet, and to punish nations if they continue to do evil and to persecute God's people. Secondly, to be used as symbolic illustrations, as we saw a lot in our study of Revelation just not too long ago. And finally, to become evidence for us today, as we compare them to what actually happened in history. If these predictions all came true, then they must have been revealed by one who knows the future and exists outside of space and time. Therefore, giving credence to the Bible being God's word, and the odds are against any other explanation, which is what we've been trying to talk about quite a bit here. We're done about, no, we're done right on time today. If there's a question here in a second, be sure to ask. Next week, we're going to do kind of a short sum up. I told you it would be a quiz. Part of it's going to be like a quiz, but I'm going to let you bring your Bibles. I'm going to let you use your note. Okay? I'm going to let you phone a friend. I don't really care what you use. And Terry's not going to give all the answers, all right? I promise that. If I have to put a piece of tape over his mouth, he's not going to give all the answers. But we're going to do a little bit of that, and then the week following, we're going to get into a totally different study for a few weeks. Any questions or comments? All right.